Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Unique Items. Today, we're going to be going over a unique item, which is. I don't know if it's very good. I did a lot of testing with it on the PTR, and I played around with like how it works, what it's adding to your character, and I can't necessarily say that it's the most amazing piece of equipment out there. It's called Assassin's Stride. And it has some effects. Let's go over the item first. Let's talk about the unique effect. Why I don't think it's really the greatest item in the world, and I don't know, maybe what they could do to fix it. So it has mobility skills, grant 100% movement speed for 2 seconds. Again, for the millionth time, I don't know why they're so enticed with these tiny, itty bitty 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 tiny movement speed buffs. Especially since you can get like 200% movement speed relatively easily. So like they don't have any movement speed on them, and they basically are designed around kind of like spamming mobility skills. So I guess in some regard, you just get 100% movement speed all the time if you're actually spamming mobility skills all the time. The problem is, though, is that if you take a look at the rogue skill tree, there's really not a lot of mobility skills on the rogue tree, believe it or not, that are actually tagged as mobility. So you're left with basically only 2 options. So the only 2 options that you have are Shadow Step, which is really nice, or Dash. So if you're doing a Dash or Shadow Step build, like this is pretty much the only 2 abilities that are actually going to get you that bonus. So if you can spam Dash in Shadow Step with 100% uptime, then you can keep that movement speed going. Unfortunately, this also means, though, that you don't get anything like enhanced number of charges or the ability to reduce your evade charges or anything like that. Next on the list is a very poopy stat, in my opinion, which is shadow resistance. Individual resistances on pieces of equipment is usually very bad, and in this particular case, it probably still is. It just has to do with the fact that most of the time you either cap all your resistances or you don't cap all your resistances. In this particular case, I could definitely use some shadow res, but I could also use some poison, cold, lightning, etc. And all it usually ends up doing is, you notice how with this particular resistance it says negative 46.3%, because I'm overcapped by 46.3%, which in most cases, when you set up your character properly, you just end up being overcapped on that specific resistance, and it doesn't actually end up helping you in any way, which is a little rough. It also has mobility cooldown reduction, up to 21% on the base item and up to 31.5% with the full boots, which of course is going to reduce the cooldown of your dash and your shadow step. It has 2 to 3 bonus to your mobility skills, and then it has 3 to 4 to your shadow imbuement, which is probably the best thing on these boots, to be perfectly honest, because that gives you a huge bonus to your shadow imbuement, which is a pretty effective ability for killing large groups of monsters. If you are an imbuement-based class, these actually are really nice for enhancing the shadow imbuement bonus, and you can't get shadow imbuement on boots normally. So, like, if you wanted to get shadow imbuement, the usual suspect for shadow imbuement is actually your helmet. So as you can see, boots roll things like agility skills, caltrops, dash, shadow step, dance of knives, etc. So in this particular case, you could never get shadow step on your boots anyway. So this is an interesting way, at the very least, where you could stack your shadow step skill level higher than you would otherwise normally be able to. Shadow step is usually, shadow imbuement is usually on your helmet, as far as I remember. And it's interesting, having the ability to get a large number of skill points in Shadow Imbuement. As you can see here, I have a greater affix of 5 on here, and you could, of course, try to triple masterwork this, so you could probably get that up to like 7 or 8, which is not a bad amount of Shadow Imbuement bonuses. Now, moving on to the unique effect. The unique effect says that mobility skills are always shadow imbued, so your dash and your shadow step are always shadow imbued now. What does shadow imbuement do? Well, shadow imbuement basically infects the monster with shadow damage. If you read the skill, it says imbue your weapons with festering shadows. Your next 2 imbuable skills will deal shadow damage and infect enemies for 6 seconds. The infected enemies explode on death, dealing damage to all surrounding enemies. If the effect expires before the enemy dies, it will deal 60% damage to that enemy. You can also have things like increased critical strike chance when enemies are infected by shadow imbuement. Shadow imbuement makes enemies vulnerable, and also enemies infected by shadow imbuement take increased non-physical damage from you. There's also some multiplier, some other things you can get here, like lucky hit chance to stun them when they have shadow damage on them. And also, when you kill an enemy that's infected with shadow damage, you get 10 energy back, which goes up to like 30. So I guess in a way, this gives you a free shadow imbuement that you could potentially utilize on your character, because if you are utilizing dash and you are utilizing the shadow step ability, you just basically get free shadow imbuement. Now, the next part of it says lucky hit damaging an elite or boss with a mobility skill has up to an 80% chance to instantly trigger a free shadow imbuement explosion. Now, I played around with this, and because it's only elites and it's only bosses, it's not quite as effective. And I think what they're trying to do here is they're trying to make it so that the boots are more useful versus bosses, or the Shadow Imbuement is more useful versus bosses, because Shadow Imbuement has always been a very poor single target damage ability, because it usually relies on the monster, well, dying. And that's not very good. There's also a new aspect that they added that could be utilized with these, that honestly I think this aspect is way better than the boots, but it's this one right here. Let's see. Shadow Imbuement. It's this one. Evading through enemies infected by Shadow Imbuement. No, that's not it. This one. If enemies infected by Shadow Imbuement take 60% up to 70% times of its damage every second, and the imbuement deals 70% increased damage. This one right here basically turns your Shadow Imbuement into more of like almost like a damage over time, kind of, but not really. It actually starts applying damage every second for your Shadow Imbuement and makes it very, very effective. If used in combination with these boots, you could of course easily apply Shadow Imbuement to any monster with your mobility skills, so you wouldn't necessarily have to actually trigger the imbuement, which is interesting. But this aspect, if you are using Shadow Imbuement, is amazing. I played around with it on the PTR, and I also played around with it on launch of the Season 7, and it's just absolutely insane. It's one of the best aspects for Shadow Imbuement, bar none. And if you're going to use Shadow Imbuement, I would highly recommend it. If you use these boots in combination with it, although you wouldn't really get as much from it, you would still get, obviously, the plus up to like 7 or 8 Shadow Imbuement from the boots, and you could potentially spam some of your mobility skills to get free Shadow Imbuement activated on the target. Now, the explosion itself that comes when you kill a monster is okay, and having it happen every now and then when you hit a target with a Shadow Imbued skill, it's all right. I played around with it a lot on the test server, and I was really disappointed in this particular part of the ability. And maybe it's just because it is, unfortunately, a lucky hit, and even stacking lucky hit doesn't often give you the results maybe that you would be looking for. Let's go take a look at this ability on the training dummies, and we'll get an idea of how this explosion works. So I'm going to need one of the mobility skills real quick. So let's grab Shadow Step. I actually do enjoy Shadow Step. I think Shadow Step is a nice ability. We're going to put this in place of the Poison Trap for the moment. Now, this actually does complete the trifecta, by the way. So there are actually aspects in the game that give you permanent imbuements. There is the cold one that gives you permanent cold imbuement on your basic attacks. There's the puncture one that gives you permanent poison imbuement every third puncture ability. And then there's now we have the mobility one, which gives you the free shadow imbuement on your mobility skills. So let's go ahead and put on one of these. I don't have very many points in shadow imbuement, so let's use the one that actually gives us 5 points in shadow imbuement. Now, when you attack a target that is a normal target, you basically just get the shadow imbuement itself. So it just automatically imbues the shadow imbuement on the target, and they are automatically shadow imbued. And then, of course, they're going to explode eventually because the timer will run out. You don't get the explosions unless you're fighting an elite or a boss. So we got to pull in an elite or a boss. And if we do this, then we can potentially get the explosions. So that was a shadow imbuement explosion right there. Let's see if we can get it to happen again. And we got another shadow imbuement explosion. It's basically just going to give you a free shadow imbuement explosion every single time that you hit the target and actually succeed in the lucky hit which is 80%. If you're built for lucky hit, you can potentially make it happen almost every single time. And if you're spamming mobility skills, like spamming them to the moon, like for instance, maybe you're spamming dash, or maybe you're spamming shadow step, or maybe you're spamming both of them. In this particular case, you could be. It's just going to give you the free shadow imbuement explosions every single time you hit an elite and succeed on the lucky hit attempt. It was okay. Like I said, the aspect that I showed you earlier felt more powerful than the boots, but it is what it is. Another problem with the boots is that, well, they take up the space of other aspects that you could potentially be using, or in the case of other uniques, like Beastfall boots, which are extremely powerful, allowing you to multiply your core skill damage. Or you could potentially just be using an aspect, which might be better in general than the bonus here. Unless you're using Shadow Imbuement, and unless you're actually taking advantage of Shadow Imbuement, this probably is not the right pair of boots for you. If you are taking advantage of Shadow Imbuement and you're putting a lot of points into it, maybe you're running the new aspect, which is the alchemical admixture, which gives you a bonus, obviously, to your imbuement damage and things like that. It could be an interesting option there if you're running like full shadow. Most people don't run shadow though, because it's very bad for single target damage. These boots try to fix that. So whether or not they actually work or not for fixing the single target part of shadow damage I'm not really entirely sure about. I found that when I was testing out the new aspect, however, that really did fix the single target damage of shadow imbuement, because what it did was it made it so that the shadow imbuement that you infected a monster with would simply tick every second and dish a massive amount of damage to the target, instead of only ticking at the end of the explosion. The explosion itself wasn't really a big part of the damage so much as the ticking was, and if you use these in combinations, you could potentially get the ticking and the explosion together, which is, I guess, something. There is a flavor text on these. They say the Viz Yektar descended on the mages indiscriminately and silently as a plague. The wise took flight, whilst the foolish fortified their dwellings as if walls or wards protected from shadow. Now, this is a new item, and the new item does have a specific drop location. Pez Radar actually posted those on Twitter. Give me just a second. I do remember where I got them from, but let's be 100% sure since this is for the video. Here we go. So the Assassin's Stride boots come from Lord Zir. So if you're looking for these particular boots, if you want to try and farm a pair, then you want to go to Lord Zir. What would you be looking for on these as far as like greater affixes go? You're going to be looking for probably the Shadow Imbuments, the mobility skills, and the mobility cooldown reduction. Obviously, the shadow resistance doesn't really matter. The special effect on these is kind of important if you want that shadow imbuement to actually work properly. So 80% is most likely what you're going to want. And in terms of like importance, mobility cooldown is probably more important than shadow imbuement and mobility skills. And this just has to do with the fact that the way that these are function is you want to be spamming your mobility skills as fast as possible to get as many shadow explosions as you can on the bosses. So the more you can use those mobility skills, the better everything's going to work. And then it's most likely going to be shadow imbuement and then mobility skills themselves. Now, I'm not entirely sure if increasing the skill rank decreases the cooldown. So no, not on shadow step. And yes on dash. So depending on which one you're using, the mobility skills could edge out over the shadow imbuement, just simply because dash actually does reduce its cooldown with skill points, whereas the shadow step does not. So that's also another little side effect there. I think that's pretty much it. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals joining me for these fun videos. Be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.